welcome to the Best in Performance. This is an interview series where we sit down with veterans and thought leaders in the web performance space, learn about the experiences that they've had and the lessons that they've learned, and the things they know now that they wish they had known, and get their thoughts on where our space is going. This interview series is brought to you by Rigor. Rigor offers cloud-based web performance solutions designed to help teams find, fix, and prevent the performance issues that are impacting their sites. You can monitor real browser experiences, multi-step API flows, and even benchmark yourself against competitors. We find a lot of people integrate us into CI/CD workflows so your team gets fast and stays fast. I'm Billy Hoffman, the CTO of Rigor, and with me today is Buddy Brewer. Buddy has been in the web performance space for nearly 15 years. He's currently the GVP of product management with New Relic. He's worked for companies in our space like LogNormal, Sosta, and Akamai. Buddy, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, great to be here, Billy.
So I always like to start with, how did you get into this crazy world of web performance?
Yeah, well, right out of college, I was living in North Carolina in Raleigh and really didn't know that I wanted to get into web performance. I knew that I wanted to work at a startup company. There were some of those in the Raleigh area, but not as many as there are, where I live now in the Bay Area, of course. But this was, gosh, to be honest, it's closer to 20 than 15 years anymore. But I'd gotten out of school and I landed at this company called Brewer that had started out, they were doing this interesting thing, if you remember SETI at Home, where you could slice up little bits of radio telescope data.
Yeah, I ran that.
Yeah, they were trying to take that model and commercialize it. And instead of hunting for space aliens, build this generic grid computing platform where you could write code and then you could deploy it and use spare CPU cycles and spare resources on people's PCs to do work. So, Brewer needed this proof of concept application to demonstrate the power of the platform. And so the proof of concept, just as it turned out, was this thing that would use spare bandwidth on PCs and go around from different locations, and you could give it a URL and it would time it and tell you how long it took to take or how long it took to download that page. Turns out, we call these pivots now in 2019, but that ended up, the proof of concept was far more interesting to the market, which wasn't ready yet to write code and deploy on this basically this commercialized botnet. And so Brewer ended up in the web performance space as a synthetic monitoring company doing last mile monitoring. So fast forward a few years to speed things up a little bit, Brewer was acquired by Gomez. Gomez was doing backbone-based synthetic monitoring and was looking to complement that with this last mile monitoring. Remember, in this period of time, in the early 2000s, a lot of people were still connecting over dial-up. Yeah. And so it was important to understand a lot of the ins and outs of, what was happening in that last mile of computing. This was also pre-mobile, so that wasn't an issue yet. But dial-up and things like that definitely were. So Gomez now had this platform that had backbone monitoring, last mile monitoring. That's how they were differentiating against Keynote, who was the other big player in the space at the time. So I stayed with Gomez engineering and product management positions until we were ultimately acquired by CompuWare, who also bought Keynote. There's been a lot of consolidation in that space. And then I left and ended up starting a rum company because I was interested in taking a look at how you might measure performance from the point of view of the actual real user, where you've got a human being in front of the computer versus simulating things with synthetic monitoring. And that gave rise to sort of the second arc of my career, where I really learned the ins and outs of real user monitoring and how it's a great complement to synthetic monitoring. And when you use them together, you can actually solve a lot of interesting performance problems.
So, and this is where I kind of want to start, because I think this is super interesting, is that you've been able to see the industry and where the interest is sort of evolve, right? Because you're talking about, hey, we want to distribute our synthetic testing across all these different systems because we need to, capture the dial-up characteristics of modems and what they're experiencing. And then you kind of almost come full circle with, all right, we can't just do backbone, we have to do it, through the modems now, but with RUM, it's kind of the same thing. That's great, your synthetic vendor's telling you this, but what is the real user experiencing? During that time, we sort of evolved in the types of metrics we can collect from sort of, page load to, start render and these different things. How have you sort of seen companies evolve their understanding of what metric they're asking for, and then what metric is actually impactful to their business?
Yeah, you know, when real user monitoring first became a thing, it was pretty limited in terms of the metrics that you could collect because browsers were very opaque about it. They didn't tell you very much at all. In fact, you know, some of the early versions of Boomerang, the open source library that, you know, all of the Run products that I worked on, the company that I helped start with the co-author, or with the founder and creator of Boomerang, who was the co-founder of LogNormal with me, that was all based on Boomerang. The Sosta Run product was all based on Boomerang. Boomerang itself came from Yahoo, who was doing their homegrown RUM solution at the time just for in-house. And in those early days, really the only metric that you could capture very reliably was onload. And even then, you couldn't get that metric for the very first page of the session because the browser wasn't telling you, hey, this is how long it took to load the page. It was just firing events like, hey, onload just fired. And so what we would do in the early days of Boomerang is actually set a cookie on unload on the page that you were leaving, set a timestamp there, and then grab a timestamp for the subsequent onload event, subtract those two to tell you how long the page took. And that works great for the second, third, fourth, and fifth, and so on pages. But for the first page, there was no way to set a cookie on whatever website you were on before you navigated to the site that you're on now. So it was tricky. It was difficult. And there were some other approximations and things to try and separate out back-end time from front-end time. But the browser itself didn't give you a whole lot. And so now fast forward to 2019, thanks to the W3C's Web Performance Working Group, there's this litany of APIs that, better yet, have been implemented by all the major browser vendors. So you can ask the browser for all sorts of information that you used to only be able to get from synthetic. So I think one of the ways that companies have evolved what they measure over time has been they understand more about the types of questions that you can ask browsers. That's one thing. It's actually given rise to another type of problem, which is now I have too many metrics. I'm not sure which one to pick to optimize. And that's one of the areas that I think is really interesting about real user monitoring as a discipline and how it's evolved over the years. When we got started doing it, we were basically producing the same reports that you see in synthetic monitoring. Because we weren't taking into account one of the unique things about RUM, which is that, while you're collecting all these technical metrics, you can collect information about what the user is actually doing and then correlate those two things together so you can understand how fast you need to be, not just how fast you are, but also back to the question that you'd asked, how fast you need to be along what dimension, what metric, which one is the one that is actually driving the business outcomes that I'm trying to create with my site.
And actually, I think that is, the two sexiest things that I think came from RUM and continue to come from RUM were, number one, by far, it exists at this intersection by its very nature of the way it works of the business metrics with the performance metrics. Where I look back at, early when I was at HP and I would be seeing, big giant PDF reports coming out of Keynote or Gomez. And it's like, those are great performance metrics, but what's the impact in the business? And sort of shifting the conversation to be not about a number that went from 3 to 4, but about how that impacted your conversion rate or your shopping cart checkout flow or cart size. Or I think technology and performance people tend to they get siloed or they get tunnel vision about the metrics and the engineering because it's what they know and it's what sort of appeals to them. But then it really reduces their impact to sort of talk to the broader business when you don't have that sort of intersection with the business metrics. And then the second thing is obviously being able to harness sort of the collective power. Going back to your, kind of setting it home, like why crunch all the stuff from Arecibo on a big giant, supercomputer, harvest the masses to get the data for you. And that's what RUM is able to do. What I'm interested in as these sort of metrics, you're right, there's almost so many metrics to choose. How, even as a technical person, I can sometimes, find myself confused of like, wait, first contentful paint versus first meaningful paint. Which one is which again? Let alone trying to explain this to somebody who did not go to an engineering school. How do you find communicating to sort of the business side, the nuances of these metrics, or maybe determining which metric, a media site versus an e-com site, that they should prioritize and care about?
Yeah, I think, it starts with the actual business objective that the company is trying to achieve. So that's been one of the big transformations in the teams that I've worked with in web performance. We've stopped leading with, look at all these metrics that you can collect. Oh my God, there's a ton of them. You know, with certain audiences that's, you know, that resonates, but with the business audiences that you're talking about, you just see the eyes glass over. And the kind of, that's not my job. And I don't understand the context of how this is relevant to what I'm trying to drive, which is, you know, some other metric that's numeric, and that, like, it's not like they're not analytical people, but they're just focused on different metrics, right? So like in commerce, for example, you know, if you want to really get someone's attention at a commerce trade show, you know, it's far better to talk about conversion rate than it is to talk about first contentful paint, right? Now, later on, if you can link those two things together, then that's great. You can build a bridge from, you know, the business constituency to the technical constituency, but you have to start with the metrics that they're familiar with. Similarly, in media, I was just having a conversation with a media executive last week, you know, and the metric that he's focused on is the number of pages in the session, because that leads directly to more ad impressions. And so getting agreement up front what the metrics are that the constituency that you're talking to cares about. So in the case of, you know, these business constituencies, it's something like conversion rate or time on site or, you know, pages per session or something like that first. Then showing how the technical metrics relate to the business objectives are how I've seen teams get the most traction. And then kind of a corollary to that is that it's important not to overpower your audience with way too many metrics, right? So just pick one or two. That gets back to the how do you prioritize your metrics piece. But I think that's one of the skills that technical teams can bring to bear to the benefit of the business teams in their organization, is to do that pre-editing. You know, set it up for them, make it easy. You know, find the relationship between the business metrics and the performance metrics, prioritize them for them, and then present, look, this is where I think we need to optimize, and this is what I think the return on the investment in that optimization would be.
Now, you and I are comfortable having that conversations because I think we do a pretty good job of straddling those lines. But I'm thinking about somebody who's viewing this, who's maybe a director of IT operations or a, you know, engineering manager or somebody like that, who, you know, thinks more in terms of, you know, shipping features in a sprint, or, you know, fixing bugs, implementing improvement, and they have a passion maybe for the user experience, or they're starting to dip their toe into sort of the performance side of things, and they know that they want to get buy-in, and they know they need to find those business people, but maybe they don't know the language, right? They don't know those things that you're talking about, like the conversion rate. How do you sort of coach people to find the right organization? Because often the business team or the analytics team is an entire different part of the reporting structure from maybe some of these people who have more traditionally owned performance. So what's your advice for how people sort of break down these organizational silos, find the right people, and then find common language so that the business folks sort of even want to have the conversation?
Yeah, and it's a great point that you bring up. You know, you can't really build a relationship with the business, right? Like it's, you know, you build relationships between, you know, people and people, right? It's a personal thing. So I think what's key is to find a partner in the other organization that you can align to and get on the same page about the connection between this metric influences that metric, and the relationship here is important to our business. If that organization is so siloed away from you that you don't know a single person that you can meet over there, then you can, you know, work your way up in your organization. Eventually, you're going to find someone who, as a part of their role and their job, interacts with lots of people in a cross-functional way, and they can help you navigate. And along the way, of course, you have to evangelize the importance of performance and the outcome that performance optimization has on the business higher and higher in your own organization. That's also beneficial. So if you have to do that first to achieve the ultimate objective of alignment between silos, then that's fine. That's where you start. You know, you get up to the right person who knows, you know, folks in other departments, create those individual relationships, and maybe set up one or two, you know, for lack of a better term, one or two lighthouse relationships, right? You don't have to win over all 50 or 100 or 300 people. If you can win over one or two folks, maybe find a couple of people who already they already agree with the idea that faster is better. They just don't have data or solid arguments about how much faster and how much better. But you find someone who's aligned in spirit, then you can partner with them and say, hey, look, how do we frame this up into something that's more actionable to our organization, that's actually going to drive investments in performance optimization, and prioritizing it. In order to say yes to that, you usually have to say no to something else. Yeah. So figuring out how much that's worth to your business and what you're going to push off in order to make your site faster for the benefit of your users.
That's awesome. And I think that's a great sort of path for people to get started. I often find on the business side, sometimes business folks, they sort of view engineering as magic, right? Like, oh, PM writes these spec docs and like thing happens. That's amazing. And so I think expectation setting is an important thing that's often overlooked when starting these performance initiatives. Like let's say you've connected with the business person, you've found common ground, you've been able to make the case that like, hey, we improve these performance metrics, it's going to impact the business. What do you find is a good way to sort of get started with setting sort of expectations for like a V1 or a V2 of starting this so you don't promise the moon? Because it's correlated. And how do you basically take baby steps and actually build success, but still have something that's impactful enough that it makes sense that you can put off, maybe postpone another feature or get it prioritized appropriately on the roadmap?
Yeah, I think as far as goal setting is concerned, a mistake that pops up every now and again is setting a goal that's too far out. It's much better to do a lot of little iterations on performance and chip away at it. Yeah. And what that does as a side effect is it creates a culture of revisiting and ingraining it as something that we're constantly doing and not just a one-off project. It's something that has to coexist as a core feature of the user's experience, just like all of the other experience design work that you're doing on your product. And so I think really the first actionable piece that it starts with, after you've identified what the business metric is that you're going to link your performance metrics to, is to make sure that in your RUM data, you're collecting in the same session of your data when you're sending all of this stuff up to, whether it's a homegrown solution or you're using a commercial vendor, that you're sending these metrics up together. So if it's conversion rate, you're noting that the conversion happened, you're sending that along on your RUM beacon along with all of the performance metrics. And once you've got it into your RUM system, most of the tools out there have some sort of facility where you can then relate about how the performance metric changes are actually driving changes in the other metrics. So whether it's the conversion rate curve that everybody's seen that goes down and to the right, where your conversion rate decays among those cohorts of users who are getting slower and slower experiences, and then you can just index along the curve. Or you can do your own cohort analysis and say, hey, pull out all of the user experiences that were, 50% slower than my current median or something like that. Just a slice. Give me a slice where you're forming a hypothesis of like, what if, or let's take the other side of it. Let's go faster, right? Yeah. So if let's say I sped up by half a second for user experiences, show me all of the users that are in that cohort and let me look at their conversion rate relative to my overall conversion rate, so that I can see how much of an improvement that would be to my business, and then I can start to share that data with people. And as I'm sharing the data, then I can start to build support for, hey, wow, it looks like spending a little bit of time to dig into this to figure out, are there ways without disrupting the overall functionality of the site that we can just speed things up a little bit? It looks like we might be able to yield more business results from that on the near term than, redoing our personalization engine or whatever it is that folks might have on the roadmap.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in this topic of sort of shifting the culture and shifting the mindset of the organization, because it feels like that's the only thing that sort of makes this stick. I mean, obviously aligning the business metrics helps a lot, but what you don't want is that, the crisis of the century of the week comes up, in the next sprint and performance things get, shunted off. And so obviously, being able to show business value, but you talked a little bit about sort of starting to build that performance culture. I'm wondering if you can maybe talk with some, specifics about how you've sort of seen different customers sort of build that from, one tech person or two tech people, and then they get synced up with the business person, actually changing the mindset of how the culture or how the company considers the performance and experience while they're building and developing and shipping all this stuff?
Yeah, I think the consistency is key there. So if I think about companies that I've worked with in the past who were really good at ingraining performance in the culture of their product development, that was a common thread that they had, was that there was a cadence, it was built in, it was regularly done. There was a consistency, it wasn't a one-off effort. And it was also something that was shared across a number of people so that you've got organizational resilience. If your performance advocate leaves and then goes to another company, the whole thing doesn't just fall apart. So, for example, we had a company that I worked with in the commerce space over in Europe a handful of years ago, where they had constant checks. I think they were doing, it must have been a synthetic agent where they were hitting parts of their application as part of the continuous integration that you talked about at the top of the session here. And what they would do is they had it automated so that if they had these service level objectives, and if the tests noticed that the site was violating them, it would actually automatically file a ticket in their ticketing system, Jira or whatever, and it would go, now it's got to get prioritized and looked at and triaged and then ultimately fixed. So they had requirements that they said, we're not going to ship software that doesn't meet these objectives, and we're going to check it as part of our continuous integration, and it's going to flow right into the workflow space where our developers already live, who can go in there and see it in their queue and pick it up and fix it. A little bit higher level, a little bit broader, was another company here in the US that would have these regular performance summits where they'd have folks from their marketing department and design and other lines of business and all of their tech staff, operations, engineering, I'm talking about a room of 50 people, but they had representatives from each of those groups. And then they would bring in their vendors and they would all go through almost sort of QBR style. Let's look at our performance together. We're all in this together for the benefit of, maintaining the performance of our site. So we're giving good experiences to our customers. And what I thought was interesting about that was, I'm in the room with one or two of my competitors. But this is the reality that all of these sites operate in, is that we are, while we're competing with each other, we're also all working together, because in order for us to be successful as vendors, our customers have to be successful. And this is what they need in order to be successful. So, they were scheduling, this customer was scheduling these regular summits that they would use to focus attention and drive and see where they're at and plan where they need to go as far as site performance.
Buddy, and that actually gets me to my next point, which is, I think it's really interesting to say that all these different vendors that have sort of been a different approach and a different sweet spot of measuring performance, when you call in on those almost like KBRs, that you were competing, but you were also all working together to help the customer be successful. Because from the customer's perspective, they're buying these different sort of methodologies and approaches because they're trying to get fast and stay fast. How have you seen customers sort of leverage the benefits of these tools and sort of use them where they best fit to sort of get a holistic view and control over their performance?
Yeah, I think there's an evolution there when companies, as their sites grow in traffic and their businesses grow in revenue, and they start to find that they've got more and more revenue risk loaded up in performance problems. And so, it justifies the acquisition of multiple tools to bring in and de-risk that, right? And so now you've got a bunch of different tools, and that's usually kind of how it happens. And initially, I think the pattern that I see is that as a result of the way they were acquired, I have a point problem. I need a point solution to address it. I have this problem over here. I need a solution to address it. I have this problem over here. They're all different types of performance problems. Maybe I need, a better handle on where I stand competitively with someone, with the rest of the sites in my peer group. Or maybe I need to have something to incorporate for pre-deployment for continuous integration. I need something to help me understand what the ROI for an improvement would be, or to track certain types of performance metrics from real users in real time. And like, it just goes on and on forever. And I think where people find themselves eventually is that they've got a bunch of different point solutions that they apply when they have this particular problem. Sometimes they're even acquired by different departments and different groups, and it just happens that way. The most mature organizations that I've worked with, they started out there. Everybody seems to start out there, but they get to the point where they say, okay, how do we bring all of this together into a performance practice at my company? It happens faster when you've got someone that's actually explicitly tasked for owning and evangelizing performance, but it's not absolutely necessary, but it sure makes things go a lot faster. And then what those people start doing is they start, a lot of times the way I see this manifest, as simple as it sounds, it's a PowerPoint deck. People pull some information out of here and there and everything, and it lands in a PowerPoint deck. And there's an analysis and an opinion that goes over that deck that says, based on all of the data, bringing it together, this is where we think we need to place our investments in performance and service of the user. Then maybe another evolution, and this is where pressure starts to come back on all of us as vendors, is folks want to not just copy and paste screens from all of the different products together into a single view in a PowerPoint deck or something, but they actually want to get the data out and then start to either put that in their own warehouse, or even just put it in a spreadsheet to do some side-by-side analysis, or to combine in a time series chart so you could get synthetic data from vendor A and run data from vendor B or something like that.
Analytic data.
Totally. And so I think that's where you start to see, when you look across the vendors today, I mean, basically all of us provide numerous ways to export data so that you can get JSON blobs out or CSV or whatever it is, so that you can then merge it with everything else and have that unified view. But it's rare to see a company that just starts out there. In fact, I struggle to think of an example of anybody that just started out there. They all get that way by, I've got a bunch of different problems. I'm buying a bunch of different solutions. Right. Oh my God, how do I pull all these things together into a higher level strategic view of performance? And then you just progressively get to the point where you're taking the data and then mashing it up.
And I really like this idea of the maturity model, because I think you sort of seen evolution from people who are initially saying, I need that smoke alarm, right? That's that's my production level monitoring that's letting me know when there's a fire, and I'm triaging. And you sort of move from a reactive to maybe a proactive approach, and starting to try to pull in different technologies or data from these different groups and get it into a consolidated view. I'm interested in that if all these companies go through these sort of maturing processes, like let's say I'm interested in how you start, right? And like where these things begin. And obviously it depends on where the company is on that maturity model. But like, let me just throw a random hypothetical at you. Let's say I've got a magic wand and poof, I just made you you own the P&L for $200 million a year e-com site. You make porcelain kitty cats and also porcelain other things. It can't just be 200 million of porcelain cats. So you are now responsible for the P&L of this big e-com site. And you, being Buddy, you understand the importance of performance and UX on those metrics. How would you start how would you build that practice? How would you assess the current state? What are the steps you would go through? And what are sort of kind of your first 3 or 6 months of trying to get a handle and implement a performance practice?
Yeah, I think, and since we're the magic wand is plopping me in a mature $200 million business, not a startup that's on its growing there, right? So, and we're assuming that in this business, there's not any current visibility, and we're kind of starting from scratch in a blank slate kind of approach, right?
Yeah.
I think for me, I would start with trying to understand 2 key relationships. The first one is the relationship between my porcelain cat company and my customers. The second relationship would be between my company, and if it's a $200 million mature business, I can't be the only company in the space selling porcelain cats. So there's got to be other ones, right? So the second one is the relationship to the competition. So relationship to my users, relationship to the competition. And that's the lens that I would look through. How do I get started around performance? So relationship to customers, that comes back to what we were talking about earlier, making sure that we're collecting data from our actual customers. That means real user monitoring, where I'm collecting the performance metrics and the business metrics in the same context so that I can relate them together. That's going to give me an idea of how well I'm meeting their expectations about performance. So I can then take that data and I can split it up into different cohorts and analyze and experiment around, okay, of the users who are getting 2-second, 3-second, 4-second, 5-second experiences, how is that weighting affecting them? The other thing I can do that I think is fascinating, like let's say I'm a global company and I sell in multiple markets in multiple countries. Sometimes user levels of patience differ from country to country. So they're more patient in certain places than in others. That's important to know too. So collecting that data, getting that stuff on board in a system where I can analyze it, helps me understand my relationship to my customers. Now, then there's the relationship with the competition. And since I can't hack into all of my competitors' websites and deploy my own JavaScript to go measure their customers, then what I'm going to do there is I'll use synthetic monitoring. Build a panel, of whichever those companies are that I think are interesting that are in my peer group, and then create a stack rank so that I can understand on an ongoing basis where I sit relative to all the other competitors. And then after doing that, that's what I do first. But another thing that I would suggest at least thinking about is the notion of the web is kind of an unfair place with regard to user expectations versus the physical world. So for example, if I'm walking into a bank, I'm going to expect a certain kind of user experience when I go into that bank. Meanwhile, if I leave that bank and I go to a department store, I'm not going to take my expectations of what happened at the bank and then project those onto the department store, because department stores and banks are very different. Similar with like a car dealership and all these other places, right? But if I go on a website, even if it's a commerce website, like my, the hypothetical porcelain cat company, the user who came to that site and came straight from Google or straight from social media or something like that is going to take the experience that they get on my site, and they're going to evaluate it in the context of all the other websites that they've been on that day. Yeah. And so that's what I mean by an unfair world. So perhaps what I would also do is just create a panel that compares how's the performance of my site relative to where I think a lot of the common places that I'm going to be acquiring traffic from are going to come from. And that doesn't mean that my pages have to load faster than Google's. Right. It just means that I need to understand where I'm sitting, and especially once I baseline it, making sure that we're not, diverging, because that could create problems with customer expectations, which will drive traffic away, which will impact revenue.
Yeah, you know what, buddy? That's the first time I've ever heard somebody talk about sort of the relative experience, right? It's kind of funny that for most customers, obviously it depends on the site, but the people that are coming to their site are coming from the biggest, most well-staffed and sophisticated performance cultures in our space, right? You think about Facebook, you think about Google, you think about Mozilla or, Etsy, some of these folks where it's just Netflix, it's in their DNA. Like I'm coming from Google, I'm coming from Facebook because I click a feed, right? And now I'm on your like maybe server-side rendered slow app, maybe it's a cold cache. And like it is it's not a great experience, but it's an even worse looking experience because I just came from Facebook. That's interesting to your point, like you don't have to be as fast, but you definitely need to be cognizant of sort of the relative look.
Yeah. I mean, if I'm on, just to call out some specific examples, these are both companies that care a lot about performance. If I'm on Nordstrom or the Washington Post, right, I'm comparing in my mind how that experience and how long I'm waiting, how that stacks up to Neiman Marcus and the New York Times. But I'm also comparing it to every site on the internet. Like, how are you compared to the internet? I have expectations about how fast the internet should be too.
Yeah.
I think it's especially because it's so straightforward to go into your marketing analytics and see where your top traffic sources are. So it's worthwhile. And again, I wouldn't spend proportionally, I wouldn't spend more time on this or even equal time versus knowing where I am relative to my actual industry competitors.
Sure.
It's an awareness that I would want to have. Just like on the marketing side, they're very aware of what those customers do that come from all these different traffic sources, the direct versus organic search versus paid search. I want to understand how my site performance is relative to where my customers are coming from.
So, buddy, I love that concise answer you gave. It was a very systemized process of what you would do as the CEO of Buddy's Ceramic Cat Company, which I'm going to go register that domain, by the way. What I'm interested in is, you know that, and I know that. Why do so many companies struggle with this? It's not like the tools aren't out there. We're both from vendors, obviously, but there's open source stuff. Web page test is amazing. I mean, I'm a vendor. I still think it's great. I think our products are great too. But like, buy my tool, don't buy my tool, but like, don't have a crappy site. Like, why do you think it's so difficult, given all the widespread availability of paid and free tools, and the widespread availability, the important to the business of doing this? Why do you think it's so hard for people to sort of stick with this and make it be consistent?
It's really hard for me to answer that question sometimes because I'm so heavily biased, right? I mean, I've spent 20 years evangelizing performance full time, trying to get people bought in. And me and other folks who work in performance will sit around at conferences sometimes. We'll ask each other the same question. We're like, man, look, like you said, customers are spoiled for choice. They're spoiled for choice. You've got free tools, commercial tools, multiple different ways to look at data. I mean, it's not rocket science, like you said earlier. The process is not that complicated. So I have to imagine that when I think about the people that have been really successful with this, again, it comes back to they've ingrained a culture and a repeatable, consistent process of looking at performance. And so, if you're an operator at a company who has a website and you would like for them to focus more on performance, there's a good chance that if you look around and inventory the tools that you've got available at your disposal, you'll already have the pieces in place to do it. So I think maybe a good first step for somebody who wants to drive more focus on performance at their company is just to try and create some kind of, even if it's a small thing, just a thing that happens over and over again that becomes a repeatable practice to create a habit of caring about web performance. So it could be just as simple as saying, you're a software engineer, you care about performance. You say, hey boss, why don't you let me pull a site report every week out of these tools and send them out to the team just so we can keep an eye on what's going on in performance, or dump it in Slack or something like that. And then start to, as every once in a while somebody comments on it, jump into the conversation, take it and adopt an iterative approach to just a little piece at a time, create a little bit more culture, a little bit more focus, and some structure and consistency around looking at performance. And I think a number of positive outcomes will happen from that, right? I mean, you'll start to create better outcomes for your customers, which will lead to better business objectives for yourself. Also, frankly, you'll get better return on the investment of the money that you're spending on whatever these tools are too. Right? I mean, a lot of times people will acquire these tools, and I'm talking about both commercial ones and free ones that they have to maintain, but they're not leveraging them to get their maximum value out of it. And a lot of that just has to do with, hey, congratulations, you got the tool, but you have to have the consistency and the process and the culture that goes along with it to make sure that you're using them to create better outcomes for your users.
That is a fantastic segue, buddy, into my final question, which is, let's say you have the DeLorean from Back to the Future and you can go back in time and you can tell, Buddy Brewer of, 2000 or 2001, what's something now from your experience, be it that the importance of culture or the the importance of data or aligning with business metrics, what's the one thing you know now that you desperately wish you had known when you started down this path?
There's probably multiple things, but one of the things that I think we got wrong, or at least we didn't focus on the right thing when we started building tools to do real user monitoring. So I remember when I first started working on that, it was basically, how do I take some of the challenges that we were facing with synthetic, which is the world that I was coming from, and fill them in using RUM as a complementary but exactly same approach as what we were doing with synthetic. So it was basically the same time series charts and the same reports and everything that we were generating for synthetic, just doing it from real users. And the analogy that I relate this back to a lot of times is, you think about, someone told me once that, like, because I wasn't around for the early days of television, but that when television first got started, it was basically radio with a camera pointing at the person, right? And so, like, imagine the news. You can listen to the news on the radio. News on TV at the time was like, somebody smoking a cigarette and reading the news off of a sheet of paper into a microphone, not taking advantage of the visual medium at all. And then later on, people started to realize, wow, I can put maps and visuals and just all sorts of things on here. And then TV exploded as a medium that became its own thing, complementary to and very aligned with radio, but fundamentally different in a lot of respects. And, I think when we started doing RUM, it was like the early days of TV, where we were just taking synthetic reports and doing them all over again, just measuring browsers instead of agents, And the most interesting thing that happened in early RUMs, when we realized that, like, wow, really, honestly, because we're talking about real people here, the technical metrics are only about half of the interesting stuff that we could be collecting. We could observe things, and obviously there's ethical implications to this and privacy implications. So there's right ways and wrong ways to do this, but we can observe how the human behaviors are being impacted by the delays. And then that becomes this profound, unique thing that makes RUM a truly useful complement to the categories of tools that people had before. I think if we'd gotten there a couple of years faster, maybe we'd be farther along than we are today.
Awesome. Buddy, thank you so much for joining us today. For all of you out there, this is one of many exciting episodes we have planned this season. We hope you found it as valuable and enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed producing it. If you'd like to follow along with the next episode, you can check them out at rigor.com/resources/webinars, and you'll see more episodes as they're published. Until then, we'll see you next time. And remember, get fast, stay fast. Thanks so much, buddy.
Thanks, Billy.
All right. There we go. That went fantastic.
Cool.
Well,
time.
yeah, like...